The town of Cedar Springs was a postcard of Americana, a quiet, tree-lined main street, a diner with checkered tablecloths, and a central park where kids played until sunset. It was the kind of place where neighbors waved at each other from porches, and everyone knew everyone else's name. For Ben Cooper, it was home. Retired for nearly a decade from a storied career as a firefighter, Ben had settled into a life of routine. Every morning, like clockwork, he stopped by Joe's Diner for a steaming cup of black coffee and a plate of scrambled eggs. The staff knew him well, especially Rachel, the bubbly waitress who always managed to sneak an extra biscuit onto his plate. "You're too good to me," Ben said with a warm smile as she placed the plate before him. "You've earned it," Rachel replied, patting his shoulder before heading off to another table. Ben ate alone at the counter, his gaze occasionally drifting to the photographs that lined the walls of the diner. Among them was a faded black and white shot of the Cedar Springs Fire Department taken years ago. Ben was there in the center, younger, stronger, and full of determination. His mind wandered back to those days filled with the adrenaline of saving lives, but also the weight of memories he couldn't escape. The bell over the door jingled, pulling him from his thoughts. A group of 3 men entered, their presence immediately changing the atmosphere. They were strangers to Cedar Springs. Not the kind of travelers passing through, but the sort who brought a sense of unease. One of them, a man with a shaved head and a black leather jacket, scanned the diner with an air of ownership. His gaze landed on Ben, who didn't look away. The moment stretched, a silent contest of wills, until the man broke eye contact with a smirk. "Morning," Rachel greeted them, her usual cheerfulness faltering just slightly. "What can I get you?" "Just coffee," the man said, his voice sharp. Ben watched them carefully as Rachel poured their drinks. They spoke in low voices, their tones filled with a mixture of laughter and something darker. "You okay, Rachel?" Ben asked softly when she returned to the counter. She hesitated, her cheerful mask slipping for a moment. "Yeah, just a little on edge, I guess. Those guys showed up yesterday too. Just lingering." Ben nodded but didn't press further. His instincts told him something was off, but it wasn't his place to interfere, not yet. Later that day, Ben strolled through town, his cane tapping lightly on the sidewalk. His left knee still gave him trouble, a constant reminder of a warehouse fire a decade ago that had nearly cost him his life. Despite the ache, he remained active, helping out around the community when he could. As he passed the corner of Maple and 4th, he spotted Emma Rourke unloading boxes of books from her car. Emma, the town's librarian, was one of the few people who could keep up with Ben's sharp wit. "Need a hand?" Ben offered, approaching with a smile. Emma looked up, her face lighting up. "I wouldn't say no to a little muscle." He chuckled. "You're in trouble if you think I've got muscle left." Together, they carried the boxes into the library. As they worked, Emma glanced at him. "You noticed those guys hanging around lately? The ones who look like they belong in a biker gang?" Ben nodded. "Yeah, something about them doesn't sit right." "They've been coming into the library too," she said, lowering her voice. "Asking questions about old town records. Weird stuff about who owns what properties. I've got a bad feeling, Ben. Have you told Travis?" Emma hesitated. "I don't want to sound paranoid, but maybe I should." "Better safe than sorry," Ben replied. "I'll mention it to him too. Probably nothing, but it doesn't hurt to be cautious." That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Ben returned home to his small, weathered house on the edge of town. It was modest but comfortable, with a sprawling garden that had become his sanctuary. He sat on the porch, sipping iced tea as the first stars appeared. The night was calm, but his mind wasn't. Something about those men gnawed at him, a memory he couldn't quite place, like a shadow just out of reach. As he sat there, the distant sound of shattering glass broke the quiet. Ben stood quickly, his heart pounding as he grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the noise. He found himself at Ruiz's Grocery, a family-owned store that had served the community for decades. One of the front windows had been smashed, and graffiti sprawled across the brick wall in bright red paint. "You're next?" Ben's jaw tightened. He stepped closer, shining his flashlight into the darkness. A figure emerged from the shadows, a lanky young man in a hoodie. "Hey!" Ben barked, his voice commanding. The figure froze for a moment before sprinting away. Ben gave chase as best he could, but his knee protested with every step. The figure disappeared into the night, leaving Ben standing alone under the flickering streetlight. The next morning, Ben met with Chief Travis Miles at the police station. Travis, a wiry man with a stern demeanor, listened intently as Ben recounted the vandalism. "I've heard about these guys," Travis admitted, "calling themselves the Coalition. Just another group looking to stir up trouble, but this is the first time they've crossed into outright threats. What are you doing about it?" Ben asked, his voice firm. "Watching for now," Travis said. "I can't act on gut feelings, Ben. I need evidence." "Evidence?" Ben gestured toward the photo of the graffiti on his phone. "How much more do you need before someone gets hurt?" Travis sighed. "I get it, Ben. Believe me, I do. But I can't do much without a solid lead." Ben left the station frustrated. He understood Travis's position, but waiting felt like a mistake. Cedar Springs wasn't the kind of town that could weather a storm like this, not without someone willing to stand up. As he walked through the streets, he noticed people watching him. Some nodded in respect, while others looked away, their fear palpable. The town he loved was on edge, its peace unraveling. Ben clenched his fists. He'd spent a lifetime fighting fires, but this was different. This was a fire he couldn't extinguish with water or foam. It was a fire of fear and hatred, and it was spreading. He couldn't stand by. Not again. The sun rose over Cedar Springs, but the town's usual morning energy felt subdued. At Joe's Diner, the regulars sipped their coffee in silence, their conversations replaced by the whispers of unease. The graffiti on Ruiz's grocery had spread quickly through the rumor mill, and everyone seemed to have their theories about who was responsible. Ben Cooper sat at the counter, stirring his coffee absent-mindedly. His mind replayed the events of the night before, the fleeing figure and the mocking red letters scrawled across the wall. He had been here before, not with vandalism, but with chaos brewing beneath the surface of the town he loved. Rachel poured him a refill, her usual cheer dimmed. "You hear about the Ruiz family? They're scared to even open the store today." "They have every reason to be," Ben replied. "But closing up shop gives these punks exactly what they want. If we don't stand up to them now, it's going to get worse." Rachel hesitated, glancing around before leaning closer. "You think it's that group everyone's been whispering about? The ones calling themselves the Coalition?" Ben nodded. "They're not just whispering anymore." That same morning, in a small house on the outskirts of town, Ryan Maddox sat at a kitchen table covered in maps and documents. His clean-cut appearance was a stark contrast to the chaos he was orchestrating. Around him, his closest followers, Colt, a wiry man with a sharp temper, and Jared, a former mechanic with a scar across his cheek, listened as Ryan outlined his plans. "This town forgot about us," Ryan began, his voice calm but intense. "For years, they ignored the people who built it. The factory workers, the truck drivers, the people who fought for a better life. Instead, they handed over the reins to outsiders. People like the Ruiz family, people who don't belong." Jared nodded, his eyes fixed on the map. "And now we're taking it back." Ryan smirked. "Exactly. Last night was just the beginning. We're sending a message, one piece at a time. By the time they realize what's happening, it'll be too late to stop us." Colt leaned forward. "And Cooper? He's already poking around. Guy's not exactly subtle." Ryan's smirk faltered, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "Ben Cooper's a relic. He's clinging to a world that doesn't exist anymore. Let him play the hero. When the time comes, he'll fall like the rest." Ben spent the day speaking with friends and neighbors, trying to gauge the town's mood. Emma Rourke, always a step ahead, had already begun piecing together information on the Coalition. They met at the library, where Emma's research covered the table like a jigsaw puzzle waiting to be solved. "You've been busy," Ben remarked, scanning the newspaper clippings and printouts of online forums. Emma pushed her glasses up her nose. "Some of us can't just charge into things headfirst, Ben. I dig for answers." "What did you find?" She pointed to a printout of a website filled with thinly veiled hate speech. The language was coded but unmistakable. Calls for action, for cleansing the town, for taking back what's ours. "This is their playbook," Emma said. They're not just a group of vandals. They're organized, and they're growing. Ben's jaw tightened. How many of them are we talking about? Hard to say, Emma admitted. But they're not just local. I found posts from neighboring towns, even cities. Ryan Maddox seems to be the ringleader, but he's got connections. Hearing Ryan's name hit Ben like a punch to the gut. Ryan had been a teenager when Ben was still a firefighter, a troubled kid with a chip on his shoulder and a knack for finding trouble. Ben had tried to steer him straight, but Ryan had always pushed back, blaming everyone else for his problems. Ryan Maddox, Ben muttered. I should have seen this coming. Emma tilted her head. You knew him? Years ago, Ben replied. He was angry, always looking for someone to blame. Looks like he finally found his target. That evening, Cedar Springs' unease turned into outright fear when a second incident occurred. Nate Carlson's auto shop, a cornerstone of the community, was broken into. Windows shattered, tools stolen, and a message spray-painted across the garage door. Not welcome. Ben arrived at the scene just as Nate was sweeping up broken glass. Nate, a burly man with grease-stained hands and a heart of gold, looked up as Ben approached. Ben, he greeted, his voice heavy with frustration. You see this? It's like a war zone out here. I see it, Ben said grimly, and I'm not going to let it go unchecked. Nate shook his head. You've always been a fighter, Ben, but this feels bigger than anything we've dealt with before. These people aren't just trying to scare us. They're trying to break us. They'll only break us if we let them, Ben replied. You're not alone in this, Nate. None of us are. As Ben helped clean up the mess, he couldn't shake the growing feeling that the coalition wasn't just attacking businesses. They were attacking the town's spirit. Meanwhile, at a secluded warehouse on the edge of town, Ryan Maddox met with his inner circle. The warehouse was their base of operations, filled with stolen supplies and makeshift propaganda materials. Carlson's shop was just the start, Ryan said, pacing in front of his men. Next, we hit something bigger. The diner. The library. Something that'll make them realize we're serious. Colt raised an eyebrow. You think they'll fight back? Ryan smirked. They're too scared. And if they're not, we'll remind them why they should be. Jared hesitated. What about Cooper? He's not exactly backing down. Cooper's a distraction, Ryan snapped. Let him chase shadows. By the time he figures out what's really happening, we'll have already won. Ben returned home late, exhaustion weighing on him. He sat on his porch, staring out at the darkened streets of Cedar Springs. Memories of Ryan as a teenager resurfaced. Memories of a kid who had once looked up to Ben but had slowly turned bitter. He thought of the town's growing fear, the fractures forming in its once tight-knit fabric. It reminded him of fighting a fire that refused to die, its embers smoldering long after the flames were extinguished. As he sat there, he made a decision. He wasn't just going to watch this unfold. He was going to stop it, no matter what it took. The first step, he realized, was understanding the full extent of the coalition's plans. To do that, he would need allies, people like Emma, Chief Miles, and anyone else willing to stand against the darkness creeping into Cedar Springs. Ben clenched his fists, determination settling over him like armor. The fight was coming, and he wasn't about to let his town burn. The early morning fog wrapped around Cedar Springs like a protective veil, but for Ben Cooper, it felt more like a shroud. The vandalism at Nate's shop and the growing tension in the town were pushing him to act faster. Every conversation, every new incident, painted a picture of a community on the verge of unraveling. Ben stood in his garden, the cool soil beneath his boots grounding him as he surveyed the rows of vegetables he tended religiously. The garden was his refuge, a place where he could think without distraction. This morning, though, the peaceful act of pruning a row of tomato plants couldn't ease his restless mind. A knock at his gate broke his concentration. Emma Rourke stood on the other side, a folder clutched tightly in her hands. Her face was pale, her eyes sharp. "We need to talk," she said without preamble. Ben nodded and gestured for her to come in. They sat at the small table on Ben's porch, the morning sun just starting to burn through the fog. Emma spread the contents of her folder out between them, printouts of online forum posts, photos of graffiti in neighboring towns, and a crude map of Cedar Springs with certain locations circled in red. "They're planning something bigger," Emma said, her voice tight. "I've been digging into the coalition's online presence. They're not just talking about Cedar Springs. They're coordinating attacks in other towns, too. But this?" She tapped the map. "This is their main focus." Ben leaned forward, studying the map. The circled locations included the diner, the library, the elementary school, and several family-owned businesses. "They're not just vandalizing," Ben said. "They're targeting the heart of this town, the places that mean something to people." Emma nodded. "They want to break us, make us feel like we don't have control anymore." Ben's jaw tightened. "What do we do?" Emma hesitated. "We take this to Travis. He needs to know what they're planning." "I'll handle it," Ben said, "but I need you to keep digging. If they're using these forums to communicate, there might be more we can find." Emma looked uneasy. "Ben, be careful. These people aren't just bullies. They're dangerous." Chief Travis Miles wasn't thrilled to see Ben walk into his office unannounced, but he listened as Ben laid out what he and Emma had uncovered. "You're telling me this group has a map of targets?" Travis asked, his brow furrowed. "Emma found it online," Ben explained. "They're not hiding their intentions very well, Travis. They're escalating." Travis leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled. "I've already got patrols keeping an eye on high-traffic areas. But without more evidence, I can't justify pulling officers from their other duties to chase this." Ben's frustration boiled over. "This isn't a theory, Travis. They've already hit Nate's shop and Ruiz's grocery. How many more warnings do you need?" Travis sighed. "Look, I get it, Ben, but I can't just go kicking down doors because you think something might happen." "It's not just me thinking," Ben shot back. "It's right in front of us. You need to stop waiting for the perfect moment to act. These people are counting on you dragging your feet." Travis's gaze hardened. "I'll do my job, Ben. You just make sure you don't go doing something that'll make mine harder." That evening, the tension in Cedar Springs hit a breaking point. At the town's weekly farmers' market, the usually bustling square felt subdued. Vendors sold their goods with forced smiles, and conversations were hushed. Ben walked through the market, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd for anything unusual. He spotted familiar faces, neighbors, friends, people who had built their lives in Cedar Springs. Many of them looked to Ben as a quiet protector, someone who had always been there in times of crisis. Near the edge of the market, a heated argument caught his attention. A group of young men stood near a stall selling handmade furniture, their voices loud and aggressive. "You don't belong here," one of the men snarled at the vendor, a middle-aged man with a weathered face and a nervous demeanor. Ben recognized the vendor, Luis Ortega, a carpenter who had moved to Cedar Springs with his family years ago. Luis's work was well-loved, his pieces scattered in homes all over town. "Leave him alone," Ben said, stepping between the group and Luis. The leader of the group, a burly man with a shaved head, smirked. "What's it to you, old man?" Ben didn't flinch. "It's my town, and I don't take kindly to people who try to tear it apart." The burly man's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of annoyance. "You think you can stop us? You're just a washed-up firefighter playing hero." Ben's eyes narrowed. "Maybe, but I've faced worse than you, kid. So why don't you walk away before this gets messy?" For a moment, the man seemed ready to push back, but something in Ben's unyielding gaze made him hesitate. With a sneer, he gestured for his group to follow him. "This isn't over," he muttered as they walked away. Later that night, Ben sat in the quiet of his living room, the weight of the day pressing down on him. He thought about Luis, about the fear in his eyes and the vulnerability that came with standing alone. Ben couldn't let that fear take root in Cedar Springs. The town's strength had always been its people, their willingness to look out for one another. His phone buzzed on the table, pulling him from his thoughts. It was a message from Emma. "Found something big. Meet me at the library tomorrow. It's worse than we thought." Ben stared at the message, a sense of foreboding settling over him. He clenched his fists, his resolve hardening. The lines had been drawn. If the coalition wanted a fight, Ben was ready to give them one. The next morning, Cedar Springs awoke under gray skies, as if the weather reflected the growing tension in the town. Ben Cooper arrived at the library before it opened, his steps brisk despite the ache in his knee. Emma Rourke was waiting for him inside, her usual calm replaced by nervous energy. "Thanks for coming," she said, motioning for Ben to follow her into the small reading room at the back. The table was covered in papers, maps, and a laptop displaying a web forum. Emma leaned over the setup, her fingers tapping anxiously on the keys. "Tell me everything," Ben said, pulling out a chair. Emma nodded and began explaining. "Last night, I found more on the Coalition's online activity. They're not just ranting in forums anymore. They've got private chats, encrypted messages. But some of their members aren't as tech-savvy as they think. I cracked one of their accounts and look." She turned the laptop toward Ben. On the screen was a spreadsheet of names, addresses, and notes, people and places in Cedar Springs that the Coalition had marked as targets. "They're organized," Emma continued. "They've divided the town into zones. The library, the diner, even the school. They're planning coordinated attacks, and soon." Ben's stomach tightened as he scanned the list. "What's this note here? Phase 2. Emma hesitated. "I think Phase 2 is what happens after they've scared everyone into submission. They move in, start taking over businesses, enforcing their so-called rules. This isn't just about causing chaos, it's about control." Ben's jaw tightened. "And Ryan Maddox is behind all this?" Emma nodded. "Everything I've found points back to him. He's not just leading the Coalition, he's shaping it into something bigger." Ben sat back, running a hand through his hair. The scope of the threat was more than he'd anticipated. This wasn't just vandalism or intimidation. It was a calculated effort to break the spirit of Cedar Springs and remake it in Ryan's image. By noon, Ben had taken the information to Chief Travis Miles. The two men sat in the chief's office, the evidence spread out between them. "This is enough, Travis," Ben said. "You can't ignore it anymore." Travis studied the spreadsheet, his expression grim. "This changes things," he admitted. "But I still can't launch a full-scale operation without more. If we act too soon, we risk tipping them off, and then we lose the element of surprise." "We don't have time to wait," Ben argued. "You saw what they did to Nate's shop. What happens when they go after the school? Or the families on this list?" Travis sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I'll increase patrols around the key locations. But if we're going to stop them for good, we need to catch them in the act. Something we can take to court." Ben clenched his fists, frustrated but unwilling to back down. "Then we need to make sure they don't get the chance to carry out Phase 2. That evening, Ben and Emma organized a meeting at the church. It wasn't advertised. Word spread quietly among trusted members of the community. By the time Ben arrived, the pews were filled with concerned faces. Small business owners, teachers, parents, and retirees. Ben stood at the front, Emma by his side. The murmurs quieted as he began to speak. "I know you're all scared," he said, his voice steady, "and you have every reason to be. This group calling themselves the Coalition, they're not just vandals or bullies. They're trying to tear this town apart, piece by piece." The crowd shifted uneasily, but Ben pressed on. "They want us to believe we're powerless, that we can't stand up to them. But that's not true. Cedar Springs has always been strong because of its people. And now, more than ever, we need to come together. We need to stand up and show them that we're not afraid." A hand shot up near the back. It was Luis Ortega, the carpenter whose stall had been targeted at the market. "What can we do, Ben? We're not fighters." "You don't need to be fighters," Ben said. "We just need to be united. Look out for each other. Report anything suspicious. Don't let them isolate you, because that's how they win." Emma stepped forward. "We've uncovered some of their plans," she added. "We know they're targeting specific places, but we don't know exactly when. If you see something, anything, let us know immediately." The room buzzed with murmurs, but before anyone could ask more questions, the church doors burst open. Ryan Maddox strode in, flanked by Colt and Jared. The room fell silent as the three men scanned the crowd, their presence as sharp and cutting as a blade. "Well, isn't this cozy?" Ryan said, his smirk laced with contempt. "A little secret meeting to talk about the big bad Coalition?" Ben stepped forward, putting himself between Ryan and the crowd. "You're not welcome here, Ryan." Ryan chuckled, spreading his arms. "It's a free country, isn't it? Or have you decided to rewrite the rules, Ben? This isn't about rules, Ben said, his voice firm. This is about a town that doesn't want you or your hate. Ryan's smirk faded, replaced by a cold glare. You think you can stop what's coming? You're living in the past, Cooper. Cedar Springs is changing, whether you like it or not. Ben didn't flinch. Not on my watch. For a moment, the two men stared each other down, the tension in the room thick enough to choke on. Finally, Ryan turned to his followers. Come on, let's let these sheep have their little meeting. As they left, Ryan glanced back over his shoulder. You're playing a dangerous game, Ben. Be careful it doesn't burn you. After the meeting, Emma pulled Ben aside. He's trying to intimidate you. Let him try, Ben replied. He doesn't scare me. He doesn't have to scare you, Emma said. But he's dangerous, Ben. Don't underestimate him. Ben nodded, but his resolve didn't waver. He wasn't about to let Ryan Maddox or the coalition tear Cedar Springs apart. As he walked home that night, the streets eerily quiet, he couldn't shake the feeling that the next confrontation was coming, and it would be sooner than anyone expected. The next day dawned with an unnatural stillness in Cedar Springs. The town's quiet streets and neatly kept lawns felt tense, as if the entire place was holding its breath. For Ben Cooper, the weight of everything Emma had uncovered and Ryan Maddox's open defiance hung over him like a storm cloud. By mid-morning, the uneasy calm shattered. The siren at the firehouse wailed through the streets, its sharp cry sending people running to windows and porches. Smoke rose in the distance, curling into the sky in an ominous plume. Ben grabbed his coat and headed for his truck, his firefighter instincts kicking in despite the years since he'd last been in uniform. The fire was at the elementary school playground. By the time Ben arrived, the Cedar Springs Fire Department had contained the blaze, but the damage was done. The wooden play structures were charred husks, their blackened remains still smoldering. Parents and children stood at the edges of the parking lot, watching in stunned silence as firefighters hosed down the last embers. Ben found Chief Travis Miles standing near the edge of the playground, his face grim. Another accident? Ben asked, his voice heavy with sarcasm. Travis turned to him, his expression tight. No one's calling this an accident, Ben. This was deliberate. And if it wasn't clear before, it's clear now. The coalition is escalating. Ben nodded toward the parents and children. They're targeting the heart of this town. What are you going to do about it? Travis sighed, running a hand through his hair. I've got patrols out looking for anything suspicious. We've got a few leads, but nothing concrete yet. It's not enough, Ben said. You need to get ahead of them. And how do you suggest I do that? Travis snapped. You think I've got a magic wand to fix this? No, Ben replied evenly. But I've got a way to get inside their plans. Travis frowned. What are you talking about? Ben hesitated, then lowered his voice. Emma found a member of the coalition, a kid who's scared out of his mind. If anyone can tell us what Ryan's planning next, it's him. The kid, Ben referred to as Eddie Nolan, a wiry young man barely out of his teens. Emma had tracked him down after noticing his name in one of the coalition's online forums. Eddie had joined the group seeking camaraderie, but what he found instead was intimidation and a growing fear of what Ryan Maddox was capable of. Ben and Emma met Eddie at the library, where he sat in a back corner, nervously fidgeting with his hoodie strings. You're Eddie? Ben asked, his tone calm but firm. Eddie nodded, his eyes darting around the room. You're the guy standing up to Ryan? That's right, Ben said, pulling out a chair. And you're going to help me do it. Eddie swallowed hard. You don't understand what he's like. Ryan doesn't just talk. He does things. He's got people who'll hurt you if you get in his way. Ben leaned forward, his gaze steady. And you think letting him keep going is going to protect you? Look at what he's already done. Fires, threats, tearing this town apart. If you don't help stop him now, there's no telling how far he'll go. Eddie hesitated, then sighed. They're planning something big, he admitted. It's all supposed to happen during the Founders' Day parade. Ryan says it's the perfect time to make the town see who's really in charge. What's the plan? Ben pressed. They're splitting into teams, Eddie said. Some of them are setting fires at key spots. Businesses, homes, anywhere they can cause panic. Others are going to disrupt the parade directly. Ryan says if people are scared enough, they'll finally listen. Ben's jaw tightened. Do you know where they're starting? Eddie shook his head. Not exactly. But there's a warehouse on the edge of town. It's where they've been meeting and storing supplies. If you're looking for answers, that's where you'll find them. Ben didn't waste time. That night, under the cover of darkness, he drove out to the warehouse Eddie had mentioned. The building sat on the outskirts of Cedar Springs, its corrugated metal walls and broken windows giving it an eerie, abandoned feel. Ben parked his truck a safe distance away and approached on foot, staying low and silent. He could see dim light spilling out from one of the windows, and as he crept closer, the sound of voices carried through the night. Peering through a gap in the wall, Ben saw Ryan Maddox standing at the center of the warehouse, surrounded by a group of men. They were gathered around a makeshift table, a map of Cedar Springs spread out before them. Tomorrow's the day, Ryan said, his voice sharp and commanding. We hit the targets in waves. Fires first to draw them out, then the parade. When they're scrambling to deal with the chaos, we make our move. What about Cooper? One of the men asked. Ryan smirked. He's nothing. Let him play hero. By the time he realizes what's happening, it'll be too late. Ben's fists clenched. He slipped away from the window, careful not to make a sound. He'd heard enough. Ben drove straight to Chief Travis's house, pounding on the door until the weary chief answered. What the hell, Ben? Travis muttered, rubbing his eyes. They're striking tomorrow, Ben said, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. The parade is their main target, but they're starting with fires around town. We need to act now. Travis's expression hardened as Ben relayed what he'd heard. This is big, he admitted, but we can't just barge into that warehouse. We need a warrant, and that takes time. We don't have time, Ben said. If we wait for paperwork, this town is going to burn. Travis hesitated, then nodded. All right. We'll station officers near the key targets and send a team to the parade route. But if this blows up, Ben? It won't, Ben interrupted. We've got one shot at stopping them, and I'm not going to let it slip away. The hours leading up to the Founders' Day parade were a blur of preparation. Officers patrolled the streets, keeping watch over the library, the diner, and other vulnerable locations. Volunteers from the community helped secure the parade route, their presence a quiet act of defiance against the coalition's threats. As the sun rose over Cedar Springs, the parade began, its cheerful floats and marching bands masking the tension that simmered beneath the surface. Ben stood near the main square, his eyes scanning the crowd for any sign of trouble. He knew Ryan was out there, waiting to strike. And when the first explosion rocked the air, coming from the direction of the library, Ben knew the fight had begun. The explosion near the library sent a shockwave through the peaceful streets of Cedar Springs. Smoke billowed into the sky, and the sound of shattering glass reverberated like an alarm. Ben Cooper's heart pounded as he ran toward the plume, weaving through the panicked crowd gathering near the parade route. Get back, he shouted to onlookers. Stay clear of the area. The library's front windows were shattered, and flames licked at the wooden shelves visible through the gaping holes. People scrambled to help, forming a makeshift chain to pass buckets of water from the nearby fountain. Ben spotted Emma Rourke standing on the library steps, coughing from the smoke as she tried to salvage what she could from the blaze. He rushed to her side, grabbing her arm. Emma, get out of here. Ben barked. I'm not leaving this place to burn, she shot back, her voice hoarse but determined. Before Ben could respond, another explosion rocked the town, this time from the direction of the diner. They're moving fast, Ben muttered. He turned to Emma. You help here. I've got to stop this before it spreads. Emma nodded reluctantly, and Ben sprinted toward the next target, his chest heaving with urgency. By the time Ben arrived at the diner, the fire had been partially contained, but the damage was significant. Rachel, the waitress who had always been so kind to him, stood outside, her face streaked with soot and tears. They just threw something and ran, she cried, pointing down the street. Ben followed her gaze and spotted two figures disappearing into an alleyway. He didn't hesitate, chasing after them with the single-minded focus that had carried him through decades of firefighting. The two men split up at the end of the alley. Ben followed the larger of the two, a burly man with a black hoodie, keeping his footsteps light. The man ducked into a warehouse near the edge of town, slamming the door behind him. Ben slowed, pressing himself against the wall as he listened. Inside, he heard voices. Ben slipped into the warehouse through a side door, keeping to the shadows. The place was dimly lit, with rows of crates stacked haphazardly. Near the center of the room, Ryan Maddox stood with Colt and Jared, their faces illuminated by the glow of a single overhead bulb. "Cooper's out there," Ryan was saying, pacing in a tight circle. "He's a stubborn old fool, but he's making this harder than it needs to be." Colt sneered. "Want me to take care of him? Wouldn't take much to shut him up for good." Ryan shook his head. "No, let him chase his tail. The more distracted he is, the better for us. The real fireworks are still coming." Ben clenched his fists, his anger simmering. He stepped out of the shadows, his voice cutting through the air. "You've got a lot of nerve, Ryan." The three men turned, startled but quickly recovering. Ryan's smirk returned, his posture relaxed. "Cooper," he drawled, "I was wondering when you'd show up." Ben's gaze swept the room, taking in the scattered crates and makeshift weapons. "It's over, Ryan. Call off your men." Ryan chuckled, shaking his head. "Over? No, Ben. It's just getting started." Colt stepped forward, his fists clenched, but Ryan held up a hand, stopping him. "You think you're the hero in all this, don't you?" Ryan continued, his tone mocking. "But this town doesn't need heroes anymore. It needs change. It needs me." Ben took a step closer. "What this town needs is for you to stop tearing it apart. You're not building anything, Ryan. You're destroying everything good about Cedar Springs." Ryan's smirk faltered for a moment, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You don't get it, Cooper. You never did." Colt lunged then, swinging a crowbar aimed at Ben's head. Ben sidestepped, grabbing Colt's wrist and twisting it sharply. The crowbar clattered to the ground, and Ben delivered a quick jab to Colt's stomach, sending him staggering backward. Jared rushed in next, wielding a length of pipe. Ben ducked the first swing and countered with a kick to Jared's shin, toppling him. Ryan watched, his smirk gone, replaced by a cold, calculating expression. "You've still got some fight left in you," Ryan said, stepping forward. "But let's see if it's enough." Ryan lunged at Ben, swinging a blade he'd drawn from his belt. Ben dodged, narrowly avoiding the gleaming steel, and countered with a sharp elbow to Ryan's ribs. Ryan grunted but recovered quickly, slashing again. The two men circled each other, their movements deliberate and precise. It wasn't just a physical fight. It was a battle of wills, years of tension and resentment boiling over. "You always thought you were better than me," Ryan snarled, his blade flashing in the dim light. "Always acting like you were this town's savior." "I never thought I was better than anyone," Ben shot back. "But I'll be damned if I let you destroy what people here have built." Ryan lunged again, but this time, Ben anticipated the move. He caught Ryan's wrist, twisting it until the blade fell to the ground. With a sharp shove, he sent Ryan stumbling into a stack of crates. Before Ryan could recover, the sound of sirens filled the air, their wailing cries cutting through the tension. "Police!" Chief Travis's voice boomed from outside. "Drop your weapons and come out with your hands up." Ryan's eyes darted toward the door, then back to Ben. For a moment, it looked like he might try to run, but Ben stepped forward, his presence imposing. "It's over, Ryan," Ben said, his voice steady. "You don't have anywhere left to go." Ryan's shoulders slumped, the fight draining out of him. He raised his hands slowly, his gaze filled with a mix of anger and resignation. The police stormed the warehouse, taking Ryan, Colt, and Jared into custody. Ben stood back, watching as the officers secured the scene and cataloged the evidence. Maps, weapons, and incriminating notes detailing the coalition's plans. Chief Travis approached him, his expression a mixture of relief and respect. "You did good, Ben," Travis said. Ben shook his head. "It's not about me. It's about this town." Travis nodded, clapping Ben on the shoulder. "Either way, it's over now. You've earned some rest." Ben watched as Ryan was led away in handcuffs, his defiant glare burning with unspoken words. For the first time in weeks, the weight on Ben's shoulders felt a little lighter. But he knew the scars the coalition had left on Cedar Springs would take time to heal. The days following Ryan Maddox's arrest brought a fragile calm to Cedar Springs. The fires had been extinguished, the vandalized businesses were being repaired, and the town was slowly beginning to breathe again. Yet, despite the relative quiet, Ben Cooper knew the battle wasn't over. Emma Rourke sat across from Ben at Joe's Diner, her laptop open and her fingers flying across the keyboard. The aftermath of the coalition's takedown had left her with more questions than answers, and she was determined to piece together the full scope of their plans. "You really think it's done?" Emma asked, glancing up at Ben. "Ryan's behind bars," Ben replied, sipping his coffee. "But he's not the only one we need to worry about. His followers are still out there, and we can't pretend they'll just disappear because their leader is gone." Emma nodded, her brow furrowed. "I've been tracking the forum posts. Some of the coalition's members are talking about regrouping. They're angry, Ben. They see Ryan as a martyr now." Ben set his cup down, his expression hardening. "Then we need to make sure they don't have the chance to do more damage." Chief Travis Miles had the same idea. That afternoon, he gathered a small team of officers and community volunteers in the town hall. Ben was among them, standing near the back of the room as Travis laid out his plan. "We've contained the immediate threat," Travis said, addressing the group, "but we can't let our guard down. We've received intel that some of the coalition's members are still active, and they're planning something to retaliate for Ryan's arrest." "What's the target?" Ben asked, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Travis sighed. "The Founders' Day Festival. It's the biggest event this town has, and it's happening tomorrow. If they're going to make a statement, that's where they'll do it." A heavy silence fell over the room. Founders' Day was a cherished tradition in Cedar Springs, a celebration of community, history, and resilience. The thought of the coalition turning it into a battleground was unthinkable. "We'll increase security," Travis continued, "but we'll need more than just police presence. We need eyes and ears everywhere, people who know this town and can spot trouble before it starts." Ben stepped forward. "You can count on me." The morning of the Founders' Day festival dawned clear and bright, a stark contrast to the tension simmering beneath the surface. The town square was a hub of activity, with vendors setting up booths, children running through the park, and the high school marching band warming up near the main stage. Ben stood near the entrance to the square, his sharp eyes scanning the crowd. He wasn't alone. Emma was stationed at the information booth with a walkie-talkie, and Nate Carlson patrolled the perimeter with a few other volunteers. The first few hours passed uneventfully, but Ben's instincts told him it was only a matter of time before something happened. His suspicions were confirmed when Emma's voice crackled through the walkie-talkie. "Ben, we've got something. A group of men just moved into the alley behind the hardware store. They look out of place." "I'm on it," Ben replied, already moving. Ben approached the alley cautiously, his footsteps silent on the pavement. He peered around the corner and saw 3 men huddled together, their backs to him. One of them held a duffel bag, which he unzipped to reveal several Molotov cocktails. Ben's blood ran cold. He stepped into the alley, his voice firm and commanding. "That's far enough." The men spun around, startled. The leader, a wiry man with a scar across his cheek, smirked when he saw Ben. "Well, if it isn't the town hero," the man sneered. "Come to save the day again?" "Put the bag down," Ben ordered. The leader chuckled. "Or what? You going to stop us all by yourself?" Ben's stance didn't waver. "If I have to." One of the men lunged at Ben with a pipe, but Ben sidestepped, grabbing the man's wrist and twisting it sharply. The pipe clattered to the ground as the man cried out in pain. The leader reached for one of the Molotov cocktails, but Ben closed the distance in an instant, knocking the bottle out of his hand before it could be lit. The third man hesitated, his confidence faltering as Ben turned to face him. "Go ahead," Ben said, his voice cold. "Try me." The man dropped the bag and bolted, his footsteps echoing through the alley. The leader growled in frustration but didn't resist as Ben forced him to the ground and secured his hands with zip ties. "Stay put," Ben muttered. "The police will be here soon." The incident in the alley was only the beginning. Over the next hour, more reports came in. Suspicious packages, masked figures spotted near the stage, and vehicles circling the perimeter of the festival. Ben, Emma, and the other volunteers worked tirelessly to intercept each threat, coordinating with Chief Travis's team to ensure the festival continued without incident. By mid-afternoon, it became clear that the coalition's plan had been dismantled. Their scattered attempts at disruption had failed, thanks to the vigilance of the community. But Ben knew the fight wasn't over yet. As the festival wound down, Ben spotted a familiar figure near the edge of the park. Colt, Ryan's second-in-command, stood watching the crowd, his expression unreadable. Ben approached him slowly, his body tense. "You're a long way from the warehouse, Colt." Colt smirked. "Just enjoying the show, Cooper. You've been busy today." "Walk away," Ben said, his voice low. "You've lost. There's nothing left for you here." Colt's smirk faded, replaced by a flash of anger. "You think this is over? You think locking up Ryan is going to stop us?" "It's over when we say it is," Ben replied, stepping closer. "And right now, I'm saying it's done." For a moment, Colt looked like he might argue. But then he shook his head and turned away, disappearing into the crowd. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Cedar Springs began to relax. The festival had been saved, and the town's spirit remained unbroken. Ben stood near the main stage, watching families pack up their booths and children chase each other through the grass. Emma joined him, a tired but satisfied smile on her face. "We did it," she said. Ben nodded. "For now." Emma glanced at him. "You really think they'll try again?" Ben's gaze was steady. "People like Ryan and Colt don't give up easily. But this town has shown them we won't back down." Emma smiled faintly. "And we've got you to thank for that." Ben didn't respond immediately. He looked out over the square, his chest swelling with quiet pride. "We've got each other to thank," he said finally. As the last rays of sunlight faded from the sky, Ben allowed himself a moment of peace. The battle for Cedar Springs wasn't over, but for tonight, the town was safe. The morning after the Founders' Day festival, Cedar Springs was awash in a sense of quiet triumph. The previous day's events had been a testament to the town's resilience and the power of unity. Families gathered at the diner for breakfast, children played in the park, and for the first time in weeks, there was laughter in the air. Ben Cooper sat on the bench outside the library, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. The exhaustion from the festival's chaos still clung to him, but he felt a deeper sense of relief. The town had weathered the storm, and it had done so together. Emma Rourke approached, a satchel slung over her shoulder. She sat beside Ben and handed him a newspaper. The headline read, "Community Stands Tall Against Hate. Founders' Day Success Despite Threats." "You made the front page," Emma said with a grin. Ben chuckled softly. "It wasn't just me. This town stood up for itself." Emma nodded. "Still, you were the one who kept pushing. If it weren't for you, who knows how far the coalition would have gone." Ben's smile faded as he looked out at the town square. "There's still work to do. They might be scattered, but people like Ryan Maddox always find a way to resurface. We have to stay vigilant." Over the next few days, the town began to rebuild in earnest. Volunteers painted over graffiti, repaired broken windows, and cleaned up the scorch marks left by the fires. The library's new front windows gleamed in the sunlight, and Rachel's Diner had reopened with a banner reading, "Welcome back, Cedar Springs." Chief Travis Miles coordinated with state authorities to ensure that Ryan Maddox and the remnants of the coalition faced justice. With the evidence gathered from the warehouse and the testimonies of those affected, the legal case against them was airtight. Ben testified during the preliminary hearings, recounting everything he had witnessed. The courtroom was packed with townspeople, their presence a silent show of solidarity. Ryan sat at the defense table, his once defiant smirk replaced by a hollow stare. "You had every chance to make something better," Ben said during his testimony, his voice steady. "Instead, you chose to spread fear and hate. This town isn't perfect, but it's stronger than you'll ever be. Cedar Springs doesn't belong to you. It belongs to all of us." When the judge denied bail for Ryan and his co-conspirators, a quiet ripple of relief spread through the courtroom. Justice was moving forward. In the weeks that followed, Cedar Springs began to heal. The scars left by the coalition were still visible, but they served as reminders of the town's strength. The Founders' Day festival had sparked a renewed sense of community, and neighbors who had once been distant were now working together to rebuild. One evening, the town organized a gathering in the park. It wasn't a formal event, just a chance for people to come together, share food, and celebrate their resilience. Ben arrived late, greeted by waves and smiles as he made his way to a table near the center. Emma was already there, along with Rachel, Nate, and Chief Travis. They saved him a seat, and he eased into it, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting. "To Cedar Springs," Rachel said, raising a glass of lemonade. "To Cedar Springs," the group echoed, clinking their glasses together. As the sun set over the park, Ben found himself walking along the tree-lined paths, the distant sound of laughter and music filling the air. He paused near the edge of the playground, where a new structure was being built to replace the one destroyed in the fire. Emma joined him, her arms crossed as she looked at the construction. "It's going to be better than the old one," she said. Ben nodded. "Yeah, it is." Emma glanced at him, her expression soft. "You think you'll ever let yourself rest, Ben? You've done more for this town than anyone could have asked for." Ben smiled faintly. "Maybe, but there's always more to do. Cedar Springs is worth fighting for." Emma laughed lightly. "You sound like a politician. Don't tell me you're running for mayor next." "Not a chance," Ben said with a chuckle. They stood in companionable silence, watching as the first stars appeared in the sky. For the first time in months, Ben felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel: hope. A few days later, Ben received a letter in his mailbox. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. He opened it carefully, finding a single sheet of paper inside. The note read, "You may have stopped us this time, but you can't stop what's coming. The fight isn't over." Ben stared at the words, his jaw tightening. He folded the note and slipped it into his pocket, his mind already turning over what it meant. That evening, Ben sat on his porch, the familiar ache in his knee a reminder of everything he'd been through. He looked out over the quiet street, the sounds of crickets and distant laughter carrying on the breeze. Cedar Springs had faced its darkest hour, and it had emerged stronger. But the note was a stark reminder that vigilance was necessary, that there would always be those who sought to tear down what others had built. Ben leaned back in his chair, his resolve firm. The fight for Cedar Springs wasn't over, but he was ready for whatever came next. As the stars filled the night sky, Ben allowed himself a small smile. The town was safe, for now, and that was enough.